Great, thanks everyone. My talk tonight is called Food, Farms, Climate in the Future, 8 Things People Should Know and 8 Policies We Need. I'll just start, before I get into the talk itself, I'm just gonna give a little background on the NFU's policy work. I came back to the National Farmers Union to work full-time about 5 months ago, and Mara Shaw was very instrumental in that, and I'm truly grateful to her and to the board of directors and the elected officials and everybody who gave me the opportunity to come back and do something I'm extremely passionate about, and that is work on climate change. The NFU is positioned to be a Canadian leader on climate change, indeed a North American leader. When I started working on this some years ago as an outgrowth of a project in Manitoba, I was shocked by just how open the field was and how few farm organizations were really taking on this issue. And the NFU has been extremely courageous and forward-looking on this issue. The NFU is a founding member of Farmers for Climate Solutions, a coalition that now includes 15 farm member organizations across Canada. Farmers for Climate Solutions and the NFU are really getting active on this file and having a lot of very good progress. I was part of a 5-member delegation that met yesterday with the Federal Minister of Environment, Jonathan Wilkinson. We had a good meeting with Minister Wilkinson, and we passed on the information to him that farmers were well advanced in working out ways that we could reduce emissions. We were supportive of emission reduction, and we wanted to see progress on the file in ways that supported farmers' interests and their incomes. NFU member Dana Penrice was part of a delegation that met with the Minister of Agriculture, Minister Bibeau, last week. And just in terms of why we are working so hard on climate change, there's the issue itself, there's the impact on farms, there's farmers needing to do their part to reduce emissions, but also the climate issue is a lever to redirect a dysfunctional Canadian agriculture policy. If you think about all the things that are happening in agriculture, the expulsion of farmers, low net income, corporate concentration, corporations extracting most of the wealth out of the agricultural system, we believe that climate change forces us to rethink how food systems are structured. And we want to use the climate change issue not only to reduce emissions and build resilience, but also as a lever to more broadly restructure agriculture so that it is in the interest of family farms, supports the incomes, and maximizes the number of family farmers on the land. We're doing a lot of work on this. We're quantifying things. We're writing reports. As I said, we're meeting with ministers, doing government relations work, communications work, and we've got 3 flyers coming up here in the next few days that sum up what we're doing. The first flyer is kind of parallel to the talk I'm going to give tonight. 8 important insights and 8 needed policies. It's just 2 pages, and it kind of sums up everything you need to know and policies the NFU is pursuing. The second flyer is tells our members and the public and associate members how they can help advance our work. And the third one responds to requests that we've had from farmer members, and that is they want to know what can they do on their farm, how can they integrate into the long-term planning and the intergenerational planning on their farm, emissions reduction and climate resilience. So if you are on any of the NFU email lists, or if you regularly visit the website, these flyers will be out hopefully next week. We're just waiting for translation. So I'm just going to start my talk proper here. It's a little bit odd giving these talks via Zoom, and that you're not getting a lot of feedback that you would if people were in the room. So I would say if as I go along, if you have a question, if you need clarification, just jump right in rather than wait to the end. It's a couple of interruptions as we go along might not be a bad thing. So if you need to ask a question, make a quick point of clarification, just put up your hand the way we have been doing, and Tim will he'll watch for those, and he'll break in and just interrupt me so we can answer those questions as we go. If you have a larger question or a larger comment, keep that to the end. Okay, so part one of my talk, 8 things you should know about the climate crisis in agriculture. And I will say one other thing as we get started. This is about climate, but there's some really cool information about net income in Alberta, kind of in the middle of the talk. So you'll hopefully find out some things about climate, but there's also some interesting and I have to say troubling things about the income situation in Alberta in the middle of the talk. So the first thing that we should all know about the climate crisis and how it pertains to agriculture is just a little bit about what greenhouse gases are doing in the environment, in the atmosphere. The main greenhouse gas responsible for about 70% of the warming is carbon dioxide. This is a graph of carbon dioxide concentrations in Earth's atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. I'll just get you to note a few things. The first is that the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere go up and they go down over the last 800,000 years, but not once in 800,000 years did those concentrations ever peak above 300 parts per million. We can think about 300 parts per million as the long-term natural maximum for Earth's CO2 concentrations over about the last million years, which is several times longer than humans have even existed on the Earth. So not once over 300 parts per million, but look what's happened now. We've taken it to about 417 parts per million. So really levels that haven't been seen in more than a million years. Second thing is that levels are rising about 100 times faster than they ever have before. If you, I hope you can see on your screen, maybe you can see my little cursor down there in the bottom, that low point just before the current period. From there to about 1900, that's a rise of about 100 parts per million. So from there to up here, that's about 100 parts per million. That took 10,000 years. The last time CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere rose 100 parts per million, it took 10,000 years. That's the normal amount of time it takes to get that kind of increase in atmospheric concentrations. But between 1900 and now, it's risen another 100 parts per million. So it didn't take 10,000 years, it took 100. So not only are CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere at record high levels, they're rising 100 times faster than anything that we see in the geological record. So that's the first greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide. Many of you will know there are 3 main greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, which comes mainly from combustion of fossil fuels; methane, that comes from things like landfills, rice paddies, and cattle; and the third, nitrous oxide, that for an agricultural standpoint comes mainly from nitrogen fertilizer use. So I mentioned methane. This is the graph for methane concentrations in the atmosphere. This isn't 800,000 years, it's just the last 10,000. But you can see that methane concentrations in the atmosphere were more or less stable for about 9,900 years. And then just in the last 100 or so, we have tripled the amount of methane in the atmosphere. As I said, methane comes from oil and gas production. Some of you will know that natural gas is mostly methane. So the main sources are oil and gas production, landfills, rice paddies, and cattle when they're on grass. And we'll have a lot more to say about cattle and the pluses and minuses here in a moment. The third main greenhouse gas is nitrous oxide. That's the last 800,000 years of nitrous oxide concentrations in the atmosphere. You can see how they were mostly, they were going up and down, but they're staying below about 300 parts per billion. Now they're at 325 and rising quite rapidly. When we use nitrogen fertilizer, we release very large quantities of nitrous oxide. And that greenhouse gas is about 265 times as powerful as carbon dioxide when it comes to driving climate warming. Not surprisingly, if all three of the main greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are going up, so too will be temperatures. This is a graph of the last 140 or so years. You can see that the temperatures have risen above normal by almost 1 degree, with some outliers in 2016, 2019, above 1 degree and pushing 2 degrees. And we've got a very rapid increase. Temperatures are rising 10 to 100 times faster than anything we see in the long-term ice core record. So the fifth thing that we should know about emissions is something about the agricultural emissions in the provinces where we farm. So this is a graph of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture for the province of Alberta. It covers the period of 28 years from 1990 to 2018. There's a lot of different categories here, but in general, there's three main sources. So at the top of the graph in green, we've got emissions from livestock, mostly cattle, mostly methane coming out of the mouths of cattle when they digest grass. That's the dark green band. And then above that, the light green band is manure management. That includes hog manure, chicken manure, cattle manure, dairy manure, any manure that is stored and managed, but not manure that is dropped on pastures. The red band in the middle, there's actually four components there. They're a little hard to see. There's diesel fuel, gasoline, farm electricity, and farm heating fuels, mostly natural gas for heating buildings and water. When people think about greenhouse gas emissions outside of agriculture, they think a lot about CO2 from cars and houses and factories, etc. In Alberta, though, the emissions from the combustion of CO2, as you can see on that graph, is actually a fairly small part of the emissions picture, and it's dominated by emissions from cattle and nitrogen. So the emissions from nitrogen are on the bottom. Just 1 second, I'm trying to make something go away here. Okay, emissions from nitrogen are at the bottom. The dark blue is the emissions from the soil when nitrogen is used, and the light blue is emissions from nitrogen fertilizer production plants. When I give this talk to groups in Manitoba, I point out that the biggest single source of emissions in that entire province is the Koch brothers nitrogen fertilizer plant in Brandon. In Alberta, you've got big plants up in Redwater and elsewhere. The footprint from the production of nitrogen is a huge source of greenhouse gases. I mentioned nitrogen fertilizer. A lot of what's driving the upward trend in Alberta is nitrogen use. This is a graph of the tonnage of actual nitrogen nutrient put onto the land in Alberta over the last 50 or so years, 1968 to 2020. Nitrogen tonnage in Alberta has doubled since 1992, and that's one of the reasons that emissions overall in the province are going up. If cattle numbers had been stable, almost all of the upward movement would be caused by increasing nitrogen use. The seventh thing that you should know about climate change and greenhouse gases from agriculture is that sequestration won't save us. A lot of people think that perhaps we can use no-till cropping systems and better grazing systems, and somehow we can coax the soil to take up enough carbon that it will offset all of the emissions from agriculture. Or maybe I've seen actually extreme statements where our soils are going to mop up all of the emissions from industry and transport and agriculture combined. That unfortunately isn't the case. It would be great if it was. This is a graph from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. It's kind of called, well, it shows two things. The brown bars reaching upward are agricultural emissions from crops, livestock, and on-farm fuel. So that more or less corresponds to the graph I showed you a minute ago. And the gold bars pointing downward are carbon sequestration in agricultural soils. That's crop soils, that's not grazing. But what you can see there is that the emissions are quite large relative to sequestration. Sequestration doesn't somehow offset or negate all the emissions from cropping systems. And the other thing is that sequestration tonnage is actually going down. It was about 12 million tons in 2005, and it's going to be about half that in 2030 when it comes time to report on our progress to meeting our Paris emission reduction target. One of the reasons that that gold bar is getting smaller and smaller is because as soils absorb more carbon, they start to move toward equilibrium. The one way you can think about this is in Alberta, where you are, before farmers from Europe came and broke the soil and began to farm it, it had previously been grazed by bison for 10,000 years. So it essentially had 10,000 years of optimal rotational grazing. And it was unbroken grassland, deep-rooted grasses, biodiverse. The amount of carbon that was in the soil when Europeans first came and broke that land is about as much carbon as you'll ever get into that soil. There's no version of cropping and grazing systems that could actually exceed that. So that's kind of the maximum. And as more carbon goes into the soil and the soils approach that maximum, they take up carbon more and more slowly. They move toward equilibrium and saturation.
Did I see Glenn Norman's hand there for a second?
Glenn, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I'm wondering if you've taken into account here in Alberta the loss of trees, especially in the last 10 years. They've taken out all major brushlands, tree rows. We're talking millions of tons of trees have been cut down and basically burnt.
Those are hedgerows that would have been planted in the 40s.
It's more than hedgerows. It's natural bushlands and headlands.
Okay.
It's not just merely just tree rows that were planted back after the 30s. It's for example, there's a quarter section here that was about 70% trees. It was entirely brush, and it's not the only one. And then where there's been wetlands, they drain the wetlands and brush the surrounding trees as well. And to me, this seems to be a pretty major carbon sequestration loss.
Right. That absolutely, and these numbers don't take that into account. But as you point out quite rightly, there's sequestration, which is when you crop and graze optimally and get carbon into the soil. What you're talking about is essentially de-sequestration. So the opposite of sequestration. Those soils in the wetlands and those treat areas had a lot of soil carbon, and as soon as you drain the wetland or cut down the trees and start plowing that up, you start releasing that carbon, sequestration effect for sure. Yeah, so that makes this picture even worse.
Here we're talking about poplar roots as being a major storage of carbon, much more than even the trees. And the aspen poplar and the BAM trees that go, it also kills the roots. Mm-hmm. And then that becomes basically rots and turns into carbon dioxide and methane.
Yeah.
I mean, and nobody's even looking at this.
They're starting to, and we're looking at it. We're looking primarily at the destruction of wetlands right now and trying to quantify what the carbon plume from that might be. And we're certainly looking at least the soil component, not so much the above ground biomass when it comes to forest, but the soil component of that. So yeah, I'd be happy to share some numbers and some research as we can get them from the government, Glenn.
And that would include the roots of the trees, of the poplars.
You know, the truth is,
It feeds any surface biomass.
Yeah, it's worse than you think in a way, because what they do is they model this stuff. So they're essentially taking their best guess as to what's happening to those roots in that soil. They're not doing the kind of measurement that we'd like them to do.
All right, thanks, Glenn, for that question.
Thanks, Glenn. So the eighth out of 8 things that you should know about agriculture and emissions is that as emissions go up, incomes tend to go down. They're connected in a way because both, the connection is that both are related to input use. In our report, Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis, one of the key things that we point out to people is that agriculture does not produce greenhouse gas emissions. Agricultural inputs produce greenhouse gas emissions. And the more inputs farmers use, the higher their emissions. And what I'm going to show you here, I'm going to try and make the case that the more inputs farmers use, the lower their net farm income. So this is a graph of Alberta gross farm revenue from the markets. And when I say from the markets, that's because I've taken out government subsidies. So the black line going up is gross farm revenue from the markets adjusted for inflation over the past 90 years, 1929 to 2019. The gray line that doesn't go up is net farm income from the markets, realized net farm income from the markets. Again, government subsidies are subtracted out so that they don't mask what is really happening. So in order to make this a little easier to see, some of you have seen me sort of colorize this for the Canadian data. I think this is the first time you're seeing it for the Alberta data. It's actually quite striking. When I did this on Friday, I was struck at just how bad the net income situation in Alberta is. So let me just walk you through this. I'll color in the net farm income situation. The green represents years of positive net farm income. The red represents years of negative net farm income. And you can see that starting in the mid-80s, everything went to pot in Alberta, and there hasn't been much positive net farm income over the last 30 some years. I'm going to color in the gap between the black and the gray line. That blue area, that represents the difference between farmers' gross revenues from the market and their net income, what they have left after they pay their bills. So the other way you can think of that blue area is that represents farmers' input costs, the money they send to the banks, John Deere, Nutrien, Agrium, etc. And you can see that gets wider and wider and wider. And what we're seeing there is a 90-year look at gross revenue and net income. And you can see farmers are becoming more and more dependent upon inputs. A larger and larger portion of that gross revenue is going to input suppliers. And I'll just show you just how bad this has got. I'll just show you the percent that farmers get to keep. Between about the end of the Great Depression and the mid-80s, farmers were keeping about 1/3 of the money that they generated in gross revenue. Starting in 84 till now, so what is that, 26 and 19, 30, 45 years, 35 years. It works out to exactly 0%. If you add up all the positive net income years and negative net income years from 1984 till now, it's 0. So of all the hundreds of billions of dollars that Alberta farmers have generated since the mid-80s, on a net basis, they have got to keep exactly 0. And I would say that part of the problem here is a massive overdependence on purchased inputs, such that just about 100 cents out of every dollar is going to pay for fertilizer and fuel and interest on bank loans and services and machinery, etc. This is actually the worst net farm income graph I've ever seen in Canada. So turning from what we know about greenhouse gas emissions and climate and the effects that input overdependence is having on farms and their net income, I now want to turn to some of the policies that we are looking to change and transform agriculture, protect the climate, but also increase margins and redirect Canadian agriculture such that farmers can earn a living from the markets. So the first one is really focused on nitrogen fertilizer and reducing emissions of nitrous oxide, but also it's also aimed at reducing the doubling and redoubling of farmers' nitrogen use and the ever increasing fertilizer bills that come with that. So in terms of nitrogen, we need to use it more efficiently. And one way we can do that is to adopt the 4R best management practices, using the right nitrogen formulation at the right time in the right quantity and putting it in the right place. And by right place, we almost always mean sort of banded into the ground, not spread on top. If farmers aren't doing these things and they switch over to the 4R best management practices, research shows that with 30% less fertilizer, farmers can achieve the same yield. So potentially we have the possibility to reduce nitrogen fertilizer use by 30% without producing less crop. That would be a tremendous benefit in terms of margins as well. But we not only have to be more efficient, we also have to reduce use. And efficiency doesn't always lead to that. People can use something more efficiently, but at the same time use more of it. We need to reduce fertilizer use in absolute terms. And some of the ways we can do that is to offer farmers independent soil testing. So government-run labs and university labs instead of farmers relying on input suppliers for soil testing. We might put a small tax on fertilizer, say 2%, and then use all of that money collected in order to fund research that would help farmers find ways to use less fertilizer, use them more efficiently, find alternatives to purchased nitrogen, something that isn't being done right now. And we might just look at targets to reduce nitrogen use overall and maybe some caps on tonnage. And the third thing, in addition to efficiency and reducing use, is to produce the nitrogen fertilizer without emissions. I showed you before the huge amount of emissions coming from plants in Redwater, Alberta, and elsewhere. Those plants, as we move toward 2050 and net zero targets for Canada, those plants are going to have to stop producing all those greenhouse gases. So they're probably going to have to run on renewable energy, and we may have to look at carbon capture and storage for nitrogen fertilizer plants. The second policy change that we think farmers could benefit from and that would reduce emissions would be to diversify cropping approaches. Right now, we've got a real push toward fairly simple rotations and a lot of nitrogen fertilizer. We probably need to go to more complex rotations, look at cover crops, maybe intercropping, getting more nitrogen from things like legumes and biological processes and less from synthetic industrial nitrogen plants. We should try and multiply the number of organic farms and acres. That can only go so far, of course, because the markets can be easily oversupplied. So organic farming will never sort of be cover the majority of acres, but nonetheless, there's probably room to double and maybe double again the number of organic farms and acres. We really need to develop and advance agroecology as an alternative to sort of petro-industrial agriculture. The NFU is working on this in a number of fronts. I'm going to work on a report looking at agroecology as a emissions and climate and inclusion as well. Holistic management, regenerative grazing practices, all of these things really need to be brought to the forefront. They need more support and need more research dollars. And just generally, we need to increase the number of farmers on the land in order to increase resilience and adaptability. I just recently got long-term data on emissions from agriculture going all the way back to the 60s. And you can imagine the graph. The emissions go up and up and up, and the number of farmers go down and down and down. And I'm not going to claim simplistic causation there, but clearly, if you were to tell the story of the last 50 or 60 years in agriculture, it is a story of replacing farmers with machines, fuels, and technologies. And one of the ways we got to this point where we have the highest emission agricultural system in Canadian history is that long-term process of pushing ever more fuel and technology and energy into the food system at the same time we're expelling farmers. So we probably need to reverse that and have more farmers and less fuel.
I see Glenn has his hand up again.
Thanks, Glenn. Go ahead. Glenn, you're on mute. Did you have a question?
We still can't hear you, Glenn.
We may want to move on for the moment then.
Yeah.
Okay. So of the 8 policy proposals,
Can you hear me?
Yes, Glenn, go ahead.
Okay, my question was in regards to the green production of nitrogen. There was a proposal in Scientific America in regards to the production of anhydrous ammonia using solar electrical power, and that there was a actual feasibility study that it was quite feasible for a group of farmers to get together and do this. And that would that not greatly reduce the amount of emissions in production of nitrogen if we actually had a government that promoted that kind of thing and put money forward so that farmers could actually do this and produce their own nitrogen fertilizer?
Great question, Glenn. And yes, the short answer is yes. And there's even more good news here. And that is, we often hear that renewable energy is non-dispatchable. And what that means is when it's really sunny and the wind's blowing, you have lots of it. And when there's no wind and no sun, you have very little. But what things like nitrogen fertilizer plants can do is they can absorb some of that excess. So say you have built out the Canadian renewable grid, you've got lots of wind turbines and lots of solar energy. Sometimes the system will be producing more than you need, more energy. What you can do then is you can ramp up production at anhydrous ammonia plants and others and kind of absorb some of that energy. And then when you have less production and need that energy elsewhere and are maybe a little short of energy, you can ramp down that production. So not only can you have on-farm solar, but you can also have sort of large scale, and it can sort of work with your renewables to kind of take some of the variability out of the system. Thanks for the question. The third policy proposal is what we call minimum input no-till agriculture. And what minimum input no-till agriculture seeks to do is take the majority of Western Canadian acres that won't be farmed organically, just because if you ramped up organic to that level, you'd lose your premiums and it just wouldn't work. The majority of Western Canadian acres are going to be farmed using some fertilizer and chemicals. But we believe that a hybrid approach that takes the best aspects of no-till and the best aspects of organic would actually have the lowest emissions per ton of output. So just to clarify, if somebody poses the question, how do you produce a ton of wheat with the lowest possible emissions? Some people are going to immediately say no-till. That's not actually true. The nitrogen fertilizer use is so high that it's a fairly high emission system. And organic isn't actually the answer either. It produces a lot fewer tons. If you actually want to maximize your output per ton of emission, or to put it a different way, produce a ton of grain with the lowest emissions, it's actually kind of a hybrid approach where you use a no-till system, you use some fertilizer to get past nutrient bottlenecks, you use a bit of chemical to take out the worst of the weeds, you use all that strategically, but in much lower quantities than are currently being used now. So essentially you take the best ideas from organic producers where they try and get their fertility from natural sources rather than purchased sources, and you overlay that onto some of the no-till production processes we've got now. So in general, lower input systems are lower emission systems, and we need to find ways to get those low emission, low input systems more utilized by farmers. The fourth thing is we need to reduce emissions from combustion. So that essentially means electrify everything and produce electricity without emissions. So we want to electrify water heating. We want to electrify building heat, maybe electric heat or maybe heat pumps. We want to electrify agricultural trucks and someday tractors. The pictures on the right-hand side of the screen are some electric tractors, both prototypes, and the one in the middle, the blue one, is actually available for sale right now. We want to install on-farm solar arrays where it's feasible. We want to use manure biodigesters perhaps to capture methane from manure and use that for heating fuel or produce electricity. We want to retrofit farm buildings so that they're energy efficient and retrofit rural homes. And we need way better building codes, something close to net zero or passive house or LEED standards. The thing about a lot of the infrastructure, buildings, homes, tractors, is they last a long time. Every house we build right now that's low efficiency, every tractor that we buy right now, every new tractor that burns fossil fuels, those are going to be high emission systems going 30, 40, 50, and in the case of houses, maybe 100 or more years into the future. We're at the point now where we really can't afford to add any more long-lived, high-emission infrastructure to the system. We can't afford to add any more houses that aren't super efficient. We can't afford to add any more tractors that are going to be around emitting carbon dioxide for 40 or 50 years. We need to move quite quickly to produce low-emission versions and battery electric, medium-sized tractors at any rate, and possibly hydrogen-powered large tractors. Cattle. I know in that graph that I showed you before in Alberta, it's really dominated by emissions from cattle. This is a very, very difficult thing to navigate and to come up with solutions for. If you read the tackling report, you'll see that we sort of went back and forth and sort of gave on the one hand and on the other hand. But some of the basic things that you need to know, cattle emit methane when they eat grass. So that the methane problem with cattle isn't caused by factory farming or industrial livestock or feedlots. It's cattle on grass that emit methane. Cattle and feedlots have a different greenhouse gas footprint. For them, the emissions come from the production of the feed grain. So when you look at that graph, and I'll show it to you again here, of Alberta emissions, you've got the cattle emissions on the top, and you've got those nitrogen emissions on the bottom. Some of those nitrogen emissions are actually attributable to the livestock side of the equation because they're used in the growing of feed grains. So in Alberta and across Canada more generally, a lot of the emissions from agriculture are emissions from cattle. And we're just going to have to do what we can to deal with that. But having said all that, cattle provide many, many benefits. They are integral parts of critical grassland, biodiverse ecosystems. They produce manure on biodiverse mixed farms and help provide alternatives to purchased nitrogen fertilizer. They allow farmers to diversify their income streams, etc. So there's the simplistic idea somehow that cattle are just bad and to solve the climate crisis, people have to stop eating meat. As soon as you dig into this even a little bit, you realize that idea just doesn't go anywhere. So cattle build soil and increase soil carbon. I ran across a great quote. It said, God does not farm without animals. And, it's something to think about when you encounter someone who thinks, we should just get rid of the cattle. There's not when people just close their eyes and imagine a healthy, biodiverse ecosystem, they're picturing animals. And if there's no animals in that ecosystem, immediately they're picturing something that isn't sustainable. So we need to find a way to keep cattle on the land, but we need to tackle the methane problem as much as we can. So this is that graph again, showing Alberta emissions, same one I showed you earlier. Just again, at the top, a lot of emissions from cattle, and some of those blue emissions at the bottom are actually nitrogen emissions that go into producing feed for the feedlots for cattle. So we need to change not only the means, but also the goals. And when it comes to goals, I would offer this little table. So for instance, we have a goal that we want to build soil and increase carbon levels. So what we need to do there is we need cattle on grass, and we need the best possible grazing management. The industry approach, of course, is cattle in feedlots and in barns. So we need to change the way that we raise those cattle where they are. We have a goal to maximize the number of sustainable livelihoods. So we should have cattle on many small and medium-sized dispersed production units. Yet the economics of cattle production are driving us toward mega operations and concentrated production. Our goal should be to maximize the enjoyment from meat consumption. So we should focus on quality and excellence. The industry and retailers and the drive-through restaurant industry are pushing able to maximize production of commodity protein. The goal should be to maximize the supply of food for humans. So that would mean livestock animals eating waste or grazing on non-arable land. Yet the industry wants to feed grain to animals. And we want to maximize the chance of reducing methane emissions. So that probably means fewer animals and less meat consumption. The industry wants more animals and higher consumption. So that's some of the ways that we can rethink our means and our ends when it comes to livestock production. The sixth of the 8 policy proposals would be land set-asides. And here we would look at taking 5 to 10% of cropland out of production. And this gets back to a point that Glenn made. We currently have the opposite of set-asides, where we're taking land that had been set aside or that had never been farmed, that was wetlands or grasslands or treed lands for us, and we're bringing them into crop production. We should not only be protecting those areas, but we should be moving some of the marginal land now in crop production into trees and wetlands. If you look at some of that marginal land, it's absorbing a lot of inputs, it's causing a lot of emissions, and the economics of farming a lot of that marginal land, farmers are losing money on it every year, so it should be transitioned out of production. We can look at afforestation, planting trees, create wildlife habitat, restore wetlands. The soil organic matter will increase and will slow the rate of extinction, create some wildlife habitat. We need new agencies, new government authorities. So one thing that we proposed was what we're calling a super PFRA, the Canadian Farm Resilience Authority, the CFRA. So rather than the PFRA that came out of the 1930s and that particular Dust Bowl and weather event, the CFRA would be updated for the 21st century and focus really on the climate crisis that's intensifying around us. So the CFRA could manage soil testing. It could oversee fertilizer reduction research. It could help farmers identify marginal land and administer set-aside programs. It could help farmers adopt grazing best management practices such as rotational grazing, regenerative grazing, etc. And they could oversee the technical aspects of a transition to climate compatible agriculture. One of the things they could do is they could run a lot of demonstration farms where low input, low emission production practices could be refined and showcased, and farmers could come and see how those low emission, low input systems would work on their farms. Last one, this is always going to be controversial. We raise it in the tackling report. Carbon tax and refund system, very briefly, you would collect carbon taxes up and down the agri-food chain, from the fertilizer makers, from the chemical makers, the machinery companies, from the farmers, from truckers, and on down perhaps. But you would acknowledge that all carbon taxes are eventually going to be passed back to farmers. If you put a carbon tax on the natural gas going into a nitrogen plant, you can pretend that you're taxing the nitrogen company, but really that company is just going to pass it on to farmers in the form of higher fertilizer prices. So you acknowledge right from the beginning that farmers will end up paying all those carbon taxes. So then you rebate all of those carbon taxes you collect back to farmers. And you do that on a gross margin basis. And the way it would work would be, if your farm is using an average amount of energy and producing an average amount of emissions, you would pay in about the same amount you get back. It would be a wash for you. If you do things on your farm to reduce emissions, so say you find ways to use less fertilizer, maybe through 4R, maybe you produce renewable energy, etc., you'd come out money ahead, because you'd be paying less in carbon taxes and you'd be receiving back. At the other end of the spectrum, if you are the farmer in your neighborhood that uses the most nitrogen fertilizer per acre compared to all of your neighbors, you'll come out money behind, because you'll probably pay more than you will get back. And another way of thinking about this is that money that's coming back in excess of what you're paying in helps fund farmers to do the right thing, to invest in solar panels, to invest in machinery that maybe can use fertilizer more efficiently. It's got to be discussed. It's always going to be controversial, but if farmers were going to have, if they were going to pay a carbon tax, this would be the least worst version, and it's something worth thinking about. So just to recap quickly, fuel and energy, we need to electrify everything possible. Nitrogen, we need to use it more efficiently, we need to use less of it, and we need to produce it without emissions. In our cropping systems, we need to diversify them. We need better rotations, cover crops, more organic acres, and a real focus on agroecology. Also on the cropping system, we need to develop minimum input systems, low input systems, maybe minimum input no-till. In terms of cattle, we need to maximize the benefits to soils, to biodiversity, etc., while reducing the methane emissions and the impacts, and to some extent we need to reduce the numbers. Land use, we probably need to set aside 5 to 10% of cropland that's not producing a lot of crop, but is taking a lot of inputs and thus producing a lot of emissions. We need a whole bunch of new institutions. We need an expanded cohort of agronomists to do extension work with farmers. We need something like a Canadian Farm Resilience Authority to oversee all of this. And in terms of price signals and market mechanisms, we might want to look at a carbon tax and refund system. So that's my presentation. I'd be really happy if there's a whole bunch of questions and comments. And thank you very much for your attention. The Tackling the Farm Crisis and Climate Crisis report is on the NFU website. We're going to be accelerating the work on climate. So there's going to be a lot of new stuff going up on the NFU website. So you should check in with nfu.ca whenever you can. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thank you very much, Darrin. Do we have questions? Raise your hand if you can get that little blue hand going. If you can find the button to do that, or else just speak up.
I'm just trying to stop sharing my screen. Tim, can you do that for me? Thank you.
Should do it.
Thank you very much. That was excellent.
Thank you.
So we have a few minutes for questions. Does anybody have any questions for Darrin? Are you still digesting all that information? That was a lot of information in a very short time, Darrin.
If somebody wants to tell me that's too much information, and if somebody wants to give feedback and give guidance for the next time I give this presentation, I'm completely open to that. So
I doubt very much that it's too much information. It's all very good and well put together. I think we have Wanda would like to ask a question. Wanda, go ahead.
So I wonder, are you invited to like Olds College or other Fairview College, do you go and do this talk to the young the new farmers?
Thanks, Wanda. That's a great question. We're just a few months into this work. I started in April or May here, and we're looking all the time for more and more opportunities to speak. And I just saw 2 or 3 come in here in the last few days. So we're picking up the pace on that. But so far, no agricultural colleges. So the U of S has a big one, Guelph has one, and I made a note that we need to find ways to get into those ag colleges and talk to them about this stuff.
And I also think Dana Penrice from Young Agrarians, they have these mixer dates. Have they invited you to come and talk to the young agrarians?
Not the Young Agrarians, but Dana did arrange for me to come and talk to the Organic Alberta meeting a couple of years ago.
I'm actually on with Wanda here.
Oh, hi.
Hi, Dana.
Hi, Dana.
Hi, girls. So nice to see all your names on here. We miss you. We'll get you speaking more, Darrin, for sure.
Thank you.
All right, I have a question from Cynthia. Cynthia, can you unmute yourself?
What was your response from the federal agricultural minister when you spoke to him?
I spoke to the Minister of Environment. Dana, you were in the Ag Minister meeting? Do you want to talk about that?
So we went to the meeting as part of the Farmers for Climate Solutions, which the NFU is a part of and Young Agrarians is a part of. And it's kind of frustrating. Darrin and I had a discussion about this where, we really need systems change and some big policy changes, but in the government world, they want you to come up with 3 things that are applicable and doable kind of thing. So, I mean, it's a first step. Like, we're really happy that they're listening to us and engaging with us, and they want to have the COVID recovery plan be a green plan. And so our message was really around getting farmers to be part of that. And really the minister's main message back to us was to be loud and be bold. So as much as we can share these stories and how farmers can actually be part of the solution for climate change is really what she's after. It's kind of, the FDR message of, if you want this change to happen, you go get all the people on board, and then it's easier for government to make that change.
Great. I'm with the Global Foundation for Social Harmony and Sustainable Development, and what I hear is excellent. That was very thorough information that you just presented to us. And I know my organization that I'm a part of is quite in sync with what you're saying in terms of the land being brought back to health. And you've given some really good ideas as to how to do that. So the information that I've received today from you, I will certainly be passing on to you or to them. And I would like to make the NFU more aware of what this Global Foundation does as well, because I think the organizations that have things in common should sort of share things, and then we can all be stronger together.
All right, thank you, Cynthia. Do we have any other questions?
And George Calvin here.
George, go ahead.
I think each farmer should keep a certain percentage of his acres, could be 10, 15, 20%, whatever, in hay each year for the benefit of the land. And that, I did that when I farmed, and I think it worked out good. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Any other comments or questions? I see a hand up, Mara.
Kate, yeah, sorry, I guess because I'm hosting, I can't raise my hand electronically. I just wanted to let everyone know if anyone would like a hard copy of Darrin's report. I have them in the back of my car now, sitting here in Shoal Lake, Manitoba, but I'll throw them all in the mail on Monday when I'm in Saskatoon. So if anybody wants a hard copy, let me know, we'll mail it out.
Okay. Glenn, you have a question.
Yes, I do. And my question is kind of what do we do here in Alberta? Because our ag minister took it upon himself to cut 17% of the ag budget. And in that, he basically removed all the scientists. All the research scientists are now basically gone from Alberta. That nobody is looking at any kind of climate solution, any kind of water solution, anything like that. It's, you know, it's, where do we go from here? Like, what do we do with this? I mean, it's to say that we vote the government out. Well, that's good. I'm glad. I think most NFU members would be quite glad to vote out this government, but that doesn't solve the problem that we have.
Yep.
And we need much stronger voices, and we need those voices are going to have to come from outside this province, that we do something about climate solutions here in Alberta for agriculture, because it's not here.
All right, thank you. I have Doug.
Yeah, just a couple of kind of anecdotal comments. I have, as I'd mentioned previously, this past couple of years, been working in the doing farm work in the Redwater oil field area, and actually that gypsum pile that Darrin talks about is absolutely stunning. And really, it's huge. It's like a mile by a mile square, and they've got a second one going. And really, what they do all day long is, you know, because when you drive a swather these days, all you have to do is turn it around at the end of the field, so you get a chance to look at a lot of things. So basically, with great big drag lines, they first let the water evaporate, and they drag the gypsum out of the great big top of it looks like a freaking pyramid pretty much. And then it's loaded on rock trucks, and then it's trucked away to another pile. And when you just start to think of all the carbon emissions that are occurring just from that one transaction, it's absolutely phenomenal. So it's startling what's going on here in Alberta when you can see it firsthand.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Now I